Hello everyone, it is Renee, aka Vicious Vixen, and I am here to present another creation. I have wanted to make a fall themed witch for ages, and I finally started on that process by beginning with her hat. And obviously you knew from my previous video that it was not going to be an average sized hat. Give me a minute. I'll go ahead and show you how I made it. I purchased the set of 3 witch hat patterns from Kenpatsu Cosplay, and this is the most extravagant hat out of the 3. It was pretty simple to put together. I used packing tape to tape everything, and I covered the entirety of the pattern pieces in packing tape because at this time I didn't have a laminator and I wanted to save them for if I wanted to use them again, which I do plan on doing. My next witch hat, I do plan on just making my own pattern because I have a design I want to try. But if you're not comfortable with pattern making or you don't really know where to start, it is totally fine to get a base pattern from someone. The pattern calls for 5mm foam. My loves, I do not have 5mm foam, but what I do have are copious amounts of 2mm foam rolls. I think you see where this is going. I cut out basic blocks around the pattern pieces, 2 of the sheets in red and 2 sheets in white, and I used my heat gun to flatten those out as well as weighing them down with some of my heavier books. I glued the sheets together using spray adhesive, and once I ran out of spray adhesive, I used contact cement. Warning, just use the contact cement because the spray adhesive, it played me. I let those dry for about 2 days, again weighing them down, and then once they were set completely, I drew on the pattern pieces and then cut them out with a box cutter. The spray adhesive played me in the way that there were pockets where there was no adhesive at all, so when I was cutting these out, I had to go back in with contact cement to adhere everything properly. And once I got all those pieces cut out, I was able to start putting the hat together. So Taylor, aka Kenpatsu Cosplay, recommends putting each side of the hat together while they're still mostly flat and then going up the middle seam to connect them and make the final hat. I didn't do that for no particular reason. I'm not an expert in any way. I just didn't do that. But I see why. I see why. I warmed each piece of foam with my heat gun, and as it cooled, I held a curl in it to keep its shape as it set. And once it did, I started putting everything together. I put the contact cement on 2 edges, let those get tacky, and then match them up. I used my heat gun throughout this process just to keep the section malleable, and once I was done gluing the other side closed, I put it off to the side to cool, and I repeated that process with every other section. And for the tip of the crown, I used a Wonder clip to hold the edges together and then snipped off the excess once it was all set. While it was not impossible to put the hat together this way, it would definitely be much easier to just build each half and then put it together up the middle seam. I didn't exactly take account of how much time this actually took, but it was a pretty simple process, and then we ended up with this. So from here on out, I'm going to refer to the top of the hat as the crown and then the part around the head as the brim, just to use terms that are a bit easier for everyone. So that way we all know where I'm at. So the hat itself is really big. So I measured my head and compared that to the crown. which was a difference of 6 inches, and I took that out the back of the crown. I cut all the way up the seam, and I started by taking out a triangular shape at the base of the crown, but then I just went all the way up the seam, just cutting out little slivers so that way I didn't take too much out, because I still wanted it to be a gradual transition of size. It would definitely be easier to just print out the pattern at different scales before actually cutting into foam, but this worked out fine. I used heat again just to help with shaping the hat, and once I was happy with that, I closed up the seam using contact cement again. And since we altered the size of the crown, that means we have to alter the size of the brim. There was no plan to this, I need you to understand. I just wanted to try and see if I could add a different shape to the brim, and it worked out, but it was a bit of a process. The brim was more convoluted than the crown because at first I took out too much, and then I took out the wrong shape of too much, and then I ended up having to add more back into it, which is why you keep the scraps of what you cut out. Eventually I got to something that I did like, and I decided against rounding out the back of the brim again, and I just left it as these 2 points at the back of the hat, and I thought they were kind of cute. I used my Wonder clips and some jewelry wire that I had. I can't remember what gauge it is, but it's very thin. And I braided 3 strips of that wire together and covered it in hot glue so that way it acted as one when I put it around the brim of the hat. I want to say this wire was maybe like 20 to 18 gauge, but it was thin. If you didn't know, the higher the number is, the thinner the wire is. So 12 gauge is thicker than 16 gauge. I grabbed a roll of 2mm foam. This color is black. No particular reason, it's just the one I grabbed first. And I traced out the shape of the brim, and once I got that all cut out, I glued the wire to this new piece of brim that I cut out, making little tabs out of the excess foam to glue it around in certain points so that way the wire was spread out evenly. And then I glued that piece to the original brim. I started at the inner part, so the inner brim, and I worked my way out using heat and the contact cement, just working my way, spreading it out so that way things around the center were fairly even. I knew I was going to cut off a little bit excess eventually around the edge of the hat, so it was okay. I just wanted things to mostly be aligned. The last thing I did before moving on to the decorating was true up the edges. I made a quick tape pattern on the front of the brim that followed and aligned with the new center of the hat. Cut that out with the box cutter and then carefully flipped it over to repeat it on the other side of the brim. It's not exactly perfectly aligned, but I'm happy with it, and there's so much else going on with the hat you're not gonna really notice. Now on to the fabric. I've had this fabric for a while. I'm pretty sure it's a lining fabric, and I thought it'd be really pretty to go with the outer fabric that I chose, which is this that I got from Joann's. It was on the last glance. It was on the last chance clearance rack. I did not have to do anything to the outer fabric, so I just moved on to the patterning. I used packing tape. I forgot to add the cling wrap to the hat before doing this, so I put straight up packing tape onto the foam and used a Sharpie to trace out one side of the pattern, and then I took that off of the hat and then put that onto some craft paper. You can get big rolls of this at the Dollar Tree. I repeated this on the crown, making sure to add the cling film this time. And once I took it off, I also made sure to add darts into the pattern to make sure it laid flat properly. This material isn't stretchy, so I'm giving it a lot of seam allowance. Once I got the patterns prepped, I pinned my material to the table, pinned the patterns on top of the material, and then I used a heat erase pen to trace around those, making sure to add seam allowance, and then I cut them out. I'm going to go ahead and use this as a time to warn anyone who sews that I don't do very many things in the rest of this video properly. So look away from my crimes. I added fusible interfacing to the brim lining and the outer fabric of the brim, but I didn't add it to the crown. Well, not the full crown, mostly because I didn't have a lot. But I did add it to the widest part of the crown and the tip of the crown. I sewed the two halves of the lining together, easy peasy. And I was going to just start sewing the hat together here, but the bottom, the lining, it was very plain. It's very, very mundane, very monotonous. So I decided to add some interest, some very tedious interest. I decided I was going to use this sparkly thread that I have and do like quilting squares. I used a white heat erase pen in one direction and I used a red heat erase pen in the other direction, crossing over those. And once I did that, I just followed along those lines and sewed them down. You want to know how long this took me? You don't want to know how long this took me. I do like the effect. It is very subtle, but I'm happy with it. It took a while, but I'm happy with it. After aligning them in the center front of the brim with the right sides touching, I sewed the mirrored sides of the outer fabric and lining pieces together. Then I sewed each completed circle together by the inner rim. This was a smart idea and would have worked out perfectly if I did not like doing things the hard way. I flipped it so the right sides were on the outside and I placed the hat in between them. And while I started checking the sides of the brim, I realized that the edges weren't completely covered by the fabric. If I had only remembered that I was going to be using bias binding around the edges, I wouldn't have decided to undo this and then start completely over from scratch. Ha. I took the lining layer of the hat, clipped that around the bottom of the brim, and then sewed that down. If you didn't know, yes, you can sew foam. You just want to make sure that any adhesives you used are completely cured and or dried. I trimmed off the excess around the edge since I remembered this time that the binding would cover everything, and then I took the top of the hat fabric and sewed it down as well, trimming those edges too. For the crown, the fabric was clipped inside out around the form so that I could get a good fit with accurate seam allowance around the curves. And then I fought for my life to remove it without moving the clips, and then I sewed it together. I did have to fix one area by the tip of the crown because I didn't get the curve as sharp as I wanted it to be, but other than that it was pretty simple. And then I trimmed away that area, made sure all the rest of the curves were clipped and cropped properly, and then flipped it out and got the crown dressed. For the bias binding, I used a 3/8 extra wide double fold bias tape. I did a test fit around the brim, just clipping it around to make sure I would have enough. And once I was certain of that, I just cut off the excess, and then I sewed down one side all along the bottom of the brim. And then I flipped up the other side, and then I used fabric glue to adhere it to the top because I didn't really feel like hand sewing it down. And for the inner part of the brim, I just clipped into that with my scissors and then glued those edges down with some more fabric glue. To put the pieces of the hat together, sewing people, sewists, seamsters, seamstresses, seam mixes, I just hot glued it. I know y'all gonna be hurt hearing that, but I just hot glued it. I've already figured out how I'm going to actually sew the next hat together, but my order of operations was not operating in order on this one, so y'all just gonna have to let me have it. I cut away some excess foam on the inner brim because the fit was a little bit too tight, and then I hot glued the fabric up into the crown and then covered it with this felt around the edge just to add a bit of cushion. And once again, because my order of operations was out of whack, I decided now was the time to paint the inside of the hat black because I was tired of looking at the red and white. And now, on to the best part, the part that I know you have all been waiting for. The end of the video. No. The decorating. I'm so excited to decorate. To start off camera, I didn't focus on this that much. I made some wood and little faux leaves out of foam clay. I smushed them into the silicone molds that are actually made for cake decorating, and then I popped them in the freezer for like maybe 5 to 10 minutes. This stiffens them up enough so that you can peel them out and let them dry properly, because foam clay has to have air on both of the surfaces for it to dry properly. Once that was done, I broke them up into different shapes and sizes. I also used my box cutter, and then the wooden pieces I went ahead and painted in a dark kind of brown color. I used a mid-tone brown. It's just an acrylic paint. I made sure I got in all the grooves and whatnot, and then I came back with a dark, really watery wash of the brown paint. I mixed a bit of black in there. I ran it over and make sure I got in all the crevices and whatnot, and then I used a paper towel before it dried too much and then dabbed it off of the high points. And then I came back in with that mid-tone brown, just dry brushing it on the high ridges, so that way we got some variation and whatnot. To start off decorating my hat with the various flora and fauna that we have, I made 2 bases out of upholstery foam. It's 1-inch upholstery foam, and I cut out 2 scalene triangular shapes. Fun fact, scalene triangles are triangles that have unequal lengths on all sides. And after I trimmed down one of them slightly, I glued them around the base of the crown. To start adding all the flowers and decor, I started with the bigger blossoms that I really wanted to draw the eyes to, and I made sure to spread out the greenery evenly as well to break up the color groups. So since this is a fall inspired witch, I used a lot of yellows, like darker greens, darker reds and stuff like that. And as I went on, I also started adding in the faux bark that I made, as well as these cute little mushrooms and pine cones. Some of these I did keep the wires on that they originally came with because it added even more height to the arrangement. I added the moss next, covering the exposed edges of the bark as well as just filling in bare areas around the hat just to bring everything together. And once I was mostly satisfied, I took a break to attach this cute little lantern that I made. I used some invisible thread and I attached a jump ring to the hoop that came on the lantern, and I sealed that off with some B7000 just to make sure it wasn't going anywhere. I did multiple stitches around the jump ring and through the jump ring and through the fabric before tying it off and hiding the knot. And I sealed all that thread with some more of the B7000 just to make sure it didn't slip through the fabric at any point. To cover up that join, I added moss to the tip of the hat, and it also just made the hat more cohesive. And then I added the final piece of decor, butterflies. My partner Jake found these when we were at Joann's. Shout out to Joanne, she will be missed. And they were my favorite addition to the hat. I saved a few of them because I want to add them to a prop I plan to make for this costume, but after placing the final butterfly on the crown, she was ready to be presented. I am incredibly proud and satisfied with this build. I learned a lot of things. I've learned new techniques that I want to implement, and I'm also happy to share them with y'all, whether you're planning on doing this yourself or you just enjoy watching the process. I do plan on continuing this build as well as showing you all the design process that I'm working on for my Renaissance Fair fairy costume. I'm doing fall for that as well, and I also will have a poll up so you can help me decide which shaped purse that I'm going to be making. So yeah, I suppose I'll see y'all in the next video. Take care. Bye bye.